I noticed the mirror had been moved before I noticed anything else, angled just slightly toward the hallway, catching me at an unguarded slant I didn't recognize as myself. That was the morning everything stopped pretending to be temporary. I stood there longer than I meant to, coffee cooling in my hand, watching my own reflection blink back with the same tired eyes I'd carried for years, except something about the way I stood had changed, a softness in the shoulders, a hesitation in the stance. The mirror didn't accuse me. It waited. Like it knew something I hadn't admitted out loud yet. My wife was already awake. She always was. The house hummed with her quiet efficiency, the dishwasher sighing, curtains breathing open, the day being arranged without asking me for permission. That used to comfort me. Lately it made me feel like a guest in my own life. "Come here," she said gently from the bedroom, not loud, not sharp, just certain. That was her power. She never raised her voice. She didn't need to. Control, I was learning, didn't arrive with force, it arrived with consistency. When I stepped into the room, I saw the chair. The good chair. The one she only pulled out for conversations that mattered. Draped over it was a simple dress. Not dramatic. Not theatrical. Just honest. Cotton. Pale. Waiting. My chest tightened. Not with fear exactly, but with recognition. Like hearing a song you didn't know you remembered. "I washed it," she said. "It's yours now." I wanted to argue. I wanted to joke. I wanted to say this isn't me the way I had 100 times before, because saying it made it feel true. But my voice stalled somewhere behind my teeth. All I could think was how strange it felt that the dress didn't scare me. What scared me was how calm she looked. "You don't have to today," she added, because she always did. She never pushed. She guided. "But you will." That was the moment I understood. This wasn't about clothes. It was about direction. About a life quietly being reshaped while I was busy telling myself it was just an experiment, just a phase, just something we didn't have to name. The mirror caught us both then, her steady, grounded presence behind me, and me in front, unsure which version of myself I was supposed to defend anymore. I touched the fabric. My hand trembled. Not because it felt wrong, but because it felt inevitable. Somewhere deep inside, something old and exhausted loosened its grip. And the mirror didn't move away. I didn't put the dress on right away. That hesitation mattered to me, like it proved I still had choices, even as the room seemed to already know how the day would end. My wife busied herself with small things, straightening the bed, opening a window, letting light spill in with intention. She never watched me directly. She didn't have to. The mirror did that work for her. "Start with this," she said, placing something beside the dress. A soft cardigan. Neutral. Safe. The kind of garment that doesn't announce itself, that blends into domestic life the way habits do. I slid my arms into it without thinking, and the quiet shock wasn't how it felt against my skin. It was how naturally my shoulders settled, as if they'd been waiting for permission to rest. I caught my reflection again. The mirror had become unavoidable now. A silent witness tracking every micro-decision. I looked gentler. Not transformed. Not disguised. Just rearranged. "You see it," she said softly. I shook my head out of reflex, but the denial had lost its conviction. What I saw wasn't a costume. It was a version of me that didn't look like it was bracing for impact all the time. That realization stung more than any embarrassment could have. "I don't know what this makes me," I admitted, and the words surprised me by how easily they escaped. She smiled, not triumphantly, not smugly, just patiently. "It doesn't make you anything," she replied. "It lets you stop pretending." That word, pretending, lodged itself in my chest. I thought of all the years I'd rehearsed myself into shape, the way I lowered my voice on calls, squared my stance in public, performed certainty even when I felt hollow. I had mistaken effort for authenticity for so long that I didn't know how to exist without tension. She reached for the dress, lifting it carefully, like it carried weight beyond fabric. "Sit," she said. I did. The chair felt different when I sat in it. Lower. More intentional. The dress pooled in her hands as she guided it over my head. Not rushing, not ceremonial. Just matter of fact, like helping someone into a coat. The fabric settled around me, and I felt something unexpected bloom in my chest. Grief. Not sharp but heavy. Grief for the years I'd spent insisting this part of me didn't exist. When I stood again, the mirror showed a threshold version of myself. Not finished. Not complete. But undeniably changed. My wife adjusted the hem, then met my eyes in the reflection. "This isn't about control," she said quietly. "It's about honesty. And honesty changes routines." I swallowed. The house felt different now, smaller, more intimate, like it was leaning in to listen. The mirror stayed where it was. The hardest part wasn't wearing the dress. It was realizing how quickly my body learned a new grammar. My steps shortened without instruction. My hands stopped clenching. I became aware of space differently, corners, door frames, the way fabric moved when I turned. The mirror followed me from room to room now, not physically but mentally, like I'd internalized its gaze. "Breakfast," my wife said, already at the table. That word used to mean routine. Now it felt like a test I hadn't studied for. I hesitated in the doorway, suddenly aware that this wasn't a private moment anymore. This was domestic life. Mundane. Ordinary. The most dangerous place for a secret to become real. She noticed the pause. "You're allowed to take up space," she said without looking up. "Just differently." I sat. The chair felt colder than usual. I crossed my legs instinctively, then froze, waiting for myself to correct it. I didn't. That scared me more than if I had. We ate in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was observant. Every small motion felt magnified. The way I held the mug, the angle of my wrists, how I tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear before realizing what I'd done. I looked at my hands like they belonged to someone else. Or like they'd always belonged to me, and I was only just noticing. "You don't have to perform," she said finally. "This isn't a role." I laughed quietly at that because everything in my life had always been a role. Husband. Provider. The stable one. I had worn them the way I'd worn suits. Well-fitted, restrictive, applauded by others. No one ever asked if they were comfortable. After breakfast, she handed me a list. Not demands. Tasks. Laundry. Water the plants. Answer the door if the package arrives. Normal things. Domestic things. Except now they felt symbolic. Like each task was a thread stitching me further into a life I hadn't known I was capable of inhabiting. Control, I realized, didn't look like commands. It looked like expectations quietly realigning. When the doorbell rang, my heart jumped. I hadn't even thought about the outside world yet. The mirror was kind. Strangers wouldn't be. She met my eyes. "You can change," she offered. I looked down at the dress. At the way it moved when I breathed. At the person I'd already started to recognize in the reflection that lived in my head now. "No," I said, surprising both of us. "I'll answer it." As I walked toward the door, every step felt louder than the last. I wasn't afraid of being seen. I was afraid of being known. The mirror, unseen, stayed with me. The door opened to a delivery driver who barely glanced up. His attention fixed on a handheld screen, and I felt something loosen inside me at the ordinariness of it. He saw an address. A signature. A person shaped vaguely like a woman standing in a doorway. Nothing more. Nothing less. The fear I'd been bracing for arrived late, confused, with nowhere to land. "Thank you," I said, and my voice surprised me. Not because it sounded different, but because it didn't collapse under its own weight. When the door closed, I leaned my forehead against it and laughed quietly, the sound shaky and unfamiliar. The house absorbed it without judgment. I carried the package to the table, my movements careful, deliberate, as if the air itself required a gentler touch now. My wife looked up. She didn't say "I told you so." She never did. She only nodded like a teacher watching a student finally trust their own answer. The mirror in the hallway caught me again. I paused there longer this time. The dress no longer looked like an intrusion. It looked lived in. The cardigan softened the lines I'd spent years sharpening. I didn't look brave. I looked a present. "That's the first time," she said, joining me, "that you didn't flinch afterward." I searched my reflection for signs of fraud, for the telltale stiffness of someone pretending. Instead, I saw a person negotiating peace with themselves in real time. The realization was heavy enough to make my eyes sting. Later, she asked me to help with dinner. Not because she needed help, but because she wanted me there. Side by side. Domestic. The knife felt strange in my hand, not because I didn't know how to use it, but because I was aware of how I held it, the curve of my wrist, the way I leaned into the counter. I'd never noticed how much of myself I edited out during moments like these. "You're different here," she said quietly, not looking at me. At home. I almost said everyone is. Instead I said, I don't know how to go back. She stopped chopping. Met my eyes. Good, she said. Neither do I. That night, when the house settled and the lights dimmed, I stood alone in front of the mirror again. The day replayed itself in fragments. Small victories, silent tremors, moments where fear tried to reclaim ground and failed. I placed my hand against the glass. I'm still me, I whispered, testing the truth of it. The mirror didn't argue. Sleep was harder than I expected. The dress felt distant now, folded neatly on a chair. But its presence lingered like a quiet pulse beneath my skin. I lay awake, tangled between who I was and who I was becoming, the lines blurring until everything felt suspended in an uncertain space. Morning light felt like a spotlight, and I braced myself for the ritual. The dress, the cardigan, the mirror waiting patiently as always. But when I looked, the reflection didn't just show a surface change. It showed me watching myself watch back. A layered dialogue between the parts of me that wanted safety and the parts that demanded honesty. My wife's footsteps echoed in the hallway, steady grounding. She didn't say anything about the way I moved differently today, or the softness in my gaze that hadn't been there before. That silence was a language all its own. We spent the day folding laundry and organizing the kitchen, tasks that once felt tedious but now held a strange comfort, like practicing new rhythms on an instrument you thought you'd never play. I noticed how her hands moved with ease and how mine tried to mimic the same grace, clumsy but determined. There was a moment when I caught her watching me, not with judgment or expectation, but with something warmer, almost proud. It unsettled me and made my throat tighten. I wanted to reach out but didn't know if the space between us was shrinking or growing. That evening, she brought out a small box and placed it on the table without a word. Inside was a delicate necklace, simple and elegant, with a tiny charm shaped like a key. For when you're ready, she said softly. I traced the cool metal with my finger, feeling the weight of meaning behind it. It wasn't just jewelry, it was a symbol. Promise. A challenge. The mirror reflected all of it. The dress, the necklace, the hesitant smile that tugged at the corners of my mouth. I realized then that the journey wasn't about becoming someone new. It was about unlocking parts of myself I had kept hidden, even from me. Fear hadn't vanished. Shame still whispered at the edges. But beneath it all, a quiet pride was beginning to grow, fragile but undeniable. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor, my sister. She arrived unannounced, the kind of knock that felt like a crack in the usual calm, forcing the air to shift. My heart pounded as I stood in the hallway, dressed but still raw from the days of quiet transformation. I wasn't sure what to expect. Judgment? Confusion? Silence? Instead, she smiled, a flicker of recognition in her eyes. You look different, she said carefully, as if testing the waters. I nodded, unable to find words that felt real enough. The mirror's presence behind me felt like a shield and a spotlight all at once. She stepped inside, her gaze flickering to the dress, then the necklace resting lightly against my collarbone. I didn't know you were struggling, she admitted. Struggling. The word landed hard, but it was honest. I'm not sure what I'm becoming, I confessed. But I'm starting to see who I am beneath all the masks. She reached out, her hand brushing mine. A simple gesture, but one charged with unspoken understanding. You don't have to do this alone. Her acceptance cracked open a door I hadn't realized I'd slammed shut so tightly. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, not from shame but relief. The mirror caught that moment too, the soft spill of vulnerability, the fragile connection threading between us. That evening, alone again, I traced the key charm with trembling fingers. It wasn't just a promise from my wife anymore. It was a key to myself, to truth, to the complicated freedom I was beginning to grasp. Fear still lingered in the shadows, but for the first time, I felt brave enough to meet it face to face. Days blended into a rhythm that felt both foreign and familiar. I began to notice the little things, how the soft fabric of the dress moved with my breath, the way my reflection softened when I allowed myself to smile, even if just for a moment. The mirror had become less a judge and more a companion, silently witnessing my hesitant steps forward. But the outside world was still a minefield I wasn't ready to face. I found myself avoiding calls, skipping plans, and shrinking whenever I heard a voice that didn't belong to my wife or sister. The fear of rejection wasn't just a thought. It was a tight knot in my chest, reminding me how fragile this new identity still was. One afternoon, I caught my reflection unexpectedly in the window of a cafe as I passed by. For a split second I saw a stranger. Then I saw myself. A mosaic of every doubt, hope and secret longing stitched together in imperfect harmony. I wanted to turn away, but something held me there. Inside, the mirror at home waited, but this was a new reflection, one that extended beyond the walls of the house. That night, my wife and I sat quietly in the living room. No words, just presence. I realized then that control wasn't about rules or restrictions. It was about trust. Trust in her, trust in myself, trust in the slow unraveling of all the things I thought I had to hide. She reached for my hand. Her grip was steady, reassuring. "You're not alone," she whispered. And maybe I wasn't. One evening, the quiet was interrupted by a knock at the door. A neighbor I'd known for years. My heart thundered in my chest as I moved toward the entrance, the dress feeling heavier now, not from fabric, but from the weight of what might come next. When I opened the door, she smiled warmly, unshaken by the softer lines I now carried. "I just wanted to say you seem different. Happier," she said, her eyes searching mine. Her words struck me, simple yet profound. Had I really changed so much that it showed beyond my own walls? The mirror at home would have caught the hesitation and hope warring in my gaze. "Thank you," I managed, my voice steadier than I expected. She nodded and stepped inside briefly, chatting as if this was just another ordinary day. Though for me, everything felt like it was being rewritten. After she left, I stood before the mirror again. The reflection was no longer an enemy or a stranger. It was a witness to the quiet revolution happening within me, one small step at a time. The key necklace caught the light, glinting with every breath I took. I was learning to unlock the parts of me that had been silent for too long. The days that followed felt like walking a tightrope stretched between two worlds. At home, I was becoming someone I barely recognized but was starting to love. Outside, I felt like a secret kept just beneath the surface, a whisper afraid of becoming a shout. One afternoon, my wife handed me a pair of shoes, a simple but undeniably feminine pair. They weren't flashy. They didn't scream for attention. They were quiet, like the dress and the cardigan. She watched me carefully as I slipped them on, the unfamiliar weight making my ankles feel unsteady. I stood in front of the mirror, wobbled slightly, then found a tentative balance. The reflection shifted again. Not just fabric and form, but something deeper stirring. "Balance," she said, a knowing smile curling her lips. I wanted to believe it wasn't just about shoes or dresses or necklaces. It was about finding the balance between fear and acceptance, between hiding and revealing. That night, I sat alone and wrote in a journal I'd started secretly. The words were jagged and raw, but they were mine. I wrote about the mirror that no longer haunted me, about the woman in the reflection who wasn't a mask but a home. Somewhere between the lines of ink, I found a fragile kind of peace. A week later, my wife suggested we take a walk through the neighborhood, just the two of us. I hesitated, heart pounding with a cocktail of excitement and dread. The idea of stepping outside as this new version of myself was still raw, untested. We moved slowly, the evening light softening the edges of everything. I noticed how the air felt different on my skin, how the sound of my shoes against the pavement echoed differently when I walked with a softer step. The mirror wasn't there physically, but I carried it inside me now. Its steady gaze a quiet reminder that I was no longer invisible. A few neighbors passed by, their eyes flickering briefly toward me. None said anything. None stared. It was a small kindness, but it felt monumental. We talked about nothing and everything. I laughed more freely than I had in months. She squeezed my hand and whispered, "You're becoming you." I swallowed past the lump in my throat, feeling the weight of those words settle deep inside. The journey wasn't about losing control, it was about reclaiming it on my own terms. That night I stood before the mirror again, tracing the key pendant with trembling fingers. The reflection wasn't perfect, wasn't whole yet, but it was undeniably mine. And for the first time in a long time, I was ready to keep walking forward. The following days brought small victories and setbacks. There were moments when doubt crept in like a shadow at dusk, whispering that I wasn't enough, that I was fooling myself, that this path was too fragile to hold me. But then I'd catch my reflection unexpectedly. A gentle smile, a spark of pride in my eyes, And I'd remember why I chose this. One afternoon, while folding clothes, my wife found an old photograph of us before all this began. We sat together, quiet, looking at the smiling faces frozen in time. I felt a pang of nostalgia and loss, but also hope. "We've changed," she said softly, "but some things stay." I nodded, realizing that the life we were building wasn't about erasing the past, but weaving it into something new. Later that evening, as I prepared for bed, I clasped the key necklace around my neck and whispered to the mirror, "I'm ready." The reflection shimmered back, no longer a stranger but a promise. A symbol of the control I never thought I'd surrender, and the freedom I never knew it could bring. Of years pressing down. But then as I reached for the first earring, a strange calm washed over me. A mix of fear and fascination. When the cool metal touched my skin, it was like a spark igniting a forgotten part of my soul. The mirror watched. I watched the mirror. And in that reflection something shifted. Less resistance, more acceptance. A tentative embrace of the unfamiliar. For the first time, I didn't flinch away from the person looking back. I didn't want to hide. She sat beside me then, her voice softer now. "You're not a doll," she said. "You're the artist. The one who chooses the colors, the shapes, the story." But the way she said it, I felt the truth was both a gift and a challenge. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time I sensed a path forward. And it started with a mirror, some clothes, and a whispered phrase that would never leave me. The days that followed were a war waged quietly inside my mind. Every glance, every reflection, every whisper of fabric against skin was a reminder of the fragile line I now walked. At work, I kept my usual facade, but the mirror on the bathroom wall no longer felt like an enemy. Instead, it became a silent confidant, catching the subtle changes in my posture, the softness creeping into my gaze. I found myself sneaking moments alone to touch the bracelet she'd given me, tracing its delicate links as if they tethered me to a new truth. It was strange, this object. A small piece of metal holding more meaning than years of words ever had. It symbolized something I couldn't yet name. Freedom, fear, or maybe the first step toward acceptance. Social interactions became a labyrinth. Friends who had once known me well now looked through a different lens, sensing something unspoken but unable to grasp its depth. I caught the occasional smirk, the sideways glance that burned with silent judgment. Each moment was a tightrope walk between hiding and revealing, between yearning to be understood and fearing rejection. At night, the mirror became a stage where I replayed every encounter, dissecting my reactions, my voice, my expressions. I questioned everything. Was this really me? Or was I trapped in someone else's script? Yet beneath the confusion, a stubborn ember glowed, an insistence that this path, however uncertain, was mine to claim. The phrase she had planted in my mind echoed through the quiet. Mirrors don't lie. They show what's possible. I clung to it when doubt crept in, when the world felt too heavy, when I wanted to retreat into the safety of old identities. One evening, as twilight bled into the room, I caught my reflection and saw not a fragmented soul but a mosaic, broken pieces stitched together with tentative hope. I whispered the phrase aloud, my voice trembling but true. For the first time I felt the weight lift, if only a little. The turning point wasn't dramatic. It came wrapped in a small, quiet moment, the kind that sneaks up on you when you think you're prepared for nothing but routine. I was alone in my apartment, standing in front of the mirror that had become both my judge and my sanctuary. The bracelet glinted softly in the dim light, its cool touch grounding me. I tried on the dress she had chosen for me that first night. It was nothing extravagant, simple lines, soft fabric, but on me it felt like armor and invitation all at once. As I adjusted the hem, the mirror reflected not just a person trying on clothes, but someone beginning to inhabit a new skin. I wasn't sure if it was courage or desperation, but I let my fingers trace the contours of my face in the glass, searching for the person beneath the surface. The reflection shifted with every blink, every breath. And in that slow, deliberate act I realized something profound. The fight wasn't against the dress, or the bracelet, or even the expectations of others. It was against the fear that I wasn't enough as I was becoming. The silence in the room was a canvas for my thoughts, raw and tangled. I wanted to scream, to cry, to laugh. Instead, I whispered the phrase she had taught me, this time with a flicker of belief. Mirrors don't lie. They show what's possible. Possibility stretched before me like an uncharted path, terrifying but irresistible. That night, I fell asleep with the bracelet on my wrist and the dress folded carefully beside my bed. I dreamed of mirrors, endless reflections merging and parting, showing me countless versions of myself, none perfect, all real. When I woke, the reflection waiting for me was no longer a stranger. It was the beginning of someone I might one day recognize as whole. The next morning, the world outside seemed sharper, edges defined by uncertainty and possibility. I dressed with deliberate care, the bracelet clinking softly on my wrist, a small rebellion against the doubt that clung to me like a second skin. Each movement felt foreign and familiar all at once, like learning a dance that my body remembered but my mind resisted. At work, I felt the weight of countless eyes, not all hostile but none indifferent. The subtle shifts in my voice, the tilt of my head, the way my fingers grazed the hem of my shirt. Each became a battleground for my identity. Conversations felt like riddles I had to solve on the fly, navigating between who I had been and who I was becoming. The laughter that once came easily now tasted bitter, edged with the fear of being unmasked. I found myself retreating to the sanctuary of the bathroom mirror more often, tracing the fine lines of my face, marveling at how the light caught the softening curve of my jaw, the new shadows under my cheekbones. The reflection no longer demanded hiding. It invited understanding. The phrase echoed again, a mantra threading through my thoughts. Mirrors don't lie. They show what's possible. One afternoon, a colleague caught me staring at my reflection in the glass door and smiled. Not mockingly, but with something like recognition. "You're different," she said quietly, and for the first time I didn't feel the sting of exposure. Instead, I felt a fragile connection, a thread weaving me back into a world I feared I'd lost. That night, I sat before the mirror, bracelet glowing faintly in the lamplight, and whispered, "Maybe I'm not so lost after all." The reflection smiled back. Not perfectly, not completely, but with a spark that said I was ready to fight for this new version of me, no matter what lay ahead. The weekend brought a quiet challenge. I had promised myself I'd step outside the boundaries of my routine, to test how far I could walk this new path without faltering. I chose a modest dress, soft pastel, nothing flashy, but on me it felt like a statement. The bracelet gleamed against my wrist, a steady pulse of reassurance. Walking through the streets, the air felt thick with anticipation. Every glance felt amplified, every whisper magnified in my ears. I wanted to disappear, but I also wanted to be seen, to claim space that, until now, I had been too afraid to occupy. The mirror in every shop window caught my reflection, fractured and multiplied. I studied each shard, searching for the version of myself that belonged there. Inside a cafe, I caught a glimpse of a smile from a stranger, warm, genuine, unguarded. It sent a ripple through me, a mixture of hope and disbelief. Was I really becoming someone worthy of kindness? Or was it just an illusion, a trick of the light? Back home, the mirror became my confidant once more. I stood before it, fingers tracing the familiar bracelet. The phrase "mirrors don't lie. They show what's possible" had transformed from a question into a promise. I whispered it aloud, letting the words settle into my bones. But with hope came fear. Fear of rejection. Fear of losing the parts of myself that felt safe. Fear of becoming a stranger in my own skin. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and for the first time, let myself imagine a future where the mirror reflected someone I could truly love. The days blurred into a strange rhythm. Moments of tentative confidence followed by waves of doubt that threatened to pull me under. I found myself avoiding old friends, not out of shame but because I wasn't sure I could face the questions, the glances, the half-understood judgments. The mirror became my sanctuary and my tormentor, showing me possibilities I wanted to grasp and fears I wished to deny. One afternoon, I caught sight of a reflection I hadn't expected. A woman leaning against a city bus stop, bracelet glinting, eyes wide with vulnerability and defiance. She looked tired but unbroken, fragile but fierce. I felt a strange kinship with that stranger, like we were both survivors of a silent battle no one else saw. That night, alone in my apartment, I pulled the bracelet from my wrist and held it tightly. It was more than metal. It was a symbol of transformation, a talisman of hope and resilience. I whispered the phrase again, feeling it reverberate in the quiet room. Mirrors don't lie. They show what's possible. Tears slipped down my cheeks, Not from weakness but from release. The mask I'd worn for so long was cracking, and beneath it, something raw and real was beginning to take shape. I wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time I believed I could face it. Not as a doll made to please, but as someone learning to be whole. The tension between who I was and who I was becoming reached a breaking point on a chilly evening when I found myself standing before the mirror once more. The bracelet cold against my skin. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the city outside. I studied my reflection. This complex blend of vulnerability and strength, confusion and clarity, and I finally let the raw truth surface. It wasn't easy to admit. I was scared. Scared of losing the familiarity of my old self. Scared of never fitting into this new skin. Scared of the loneliness that came with walking a path so few could understand. But in that fear there was also a flicker of courage, an ember glowing beneath the ash. The phrase echoed louder now, less a whisper and more a declaration. Mirrors don't lie. They show what's possible. It wasn't just about appearance. It was about possibility itself, the chance to rewrite the story I'd told myself for years. I touched the bracelet, feeling its weight, its promise. For the first time I didn't see a doll, a reflection of someone else's design. I saw myself imperfect, evolving, and fiercely alive. The mirror had become a witness not just to transformation but to survival. That night, I slept with a heart both heavy and hopeful, knowing the journey was far from over but feeling ready to face whatever came next. The following days carried a strange kind of calm, a fragile peace that settled into the spaces where chaos had once lived. I found myself more willing to meet my reflection without flinching, tracing the lines of my face with a gentler touch. The bracelet, once a symbol of uncertainty, now felt like a quiet anchor, a reminder of the journey and the choices I was making. Outside, the world hadn't changed much. People still looked, still whispered, still judged. But I was learning to meet their eyes without shrinking, to hold space for myself even when the silence between words felt like a chasm. I was no longer just surviving, I was starting to live. One evening she called. Her voice was softer now, stripped of the power it once held over me. We spoke honestly without veils or defenses. She didn't demand anything and I didn't resist. The tension between us eased, replaced by a fragile respect born from the storm we'd weathered together. Before I hung up, she said something I hadn't expected. You're not my doll. You're something far more complicated, and far stronger. The words settled deep inside me, turning over like stones in a quiet stream. I looked at the mirror after the call, fingers resting on the bracelet. The reflection smiled back. Still uncertain, still evolving but undeniably mine. Change isn't a moment. It's a series of flickering images, fragments of who you were, and who you are becoming, stitched together by choices you didn't know you could make. I stood in front of the mirror one evening, the bracelet warm against my wrist, and for the first time, I felt a fierce sense of ownership over my reflection. The city lights cast long shadows across the room, and I saw not just a woman, but a mosaic of courage, fear, shame, and pride. The dress hung gently on my frame, no longer a costume but a declaration. I whispered the phrase one last time, my voice steady. Mirrors don't lie. They show what's possible. I thought about all the moments, the doubt, the laughter, the tears that had led me here. The social battles I'd fought silently, the acceptance I'd clawed from the edges of fear. The bracelet wasn't just metal anymore. It was a symbol of a journey that wasn't about becoming someone else, but about becoming fully myself. The doorbell rang, pulling me from my reverie. When I opened it, she stood there, not with control or demands, but with a quiet smile and an outstretched hand. It was an invitation, not to be her doll, but to walk forward as equals. For the first time I reached out without hesitation. We walked together into the fading light, two figures bound by a complicated past and an uncertain future. The bracelet on my wrist caught the last rays of the sun, gleaming like a promise, a reminder that transformation isn't about losing yourself, but about discovering what's been there all along, waiting to be embraced. I realized then that the mirror had never been an enemy. It was a teacher, reflecting not just my image but the courage it took to face it, the strength to become more than what I feared. The phrase she planted in my mind echoed one final time, a quiet anthem to the journey. Mirrors don't lie. They show what's possible. I wasn't her doll. I was myself, complex, imperfect, evolving. And in that truth I found a freedom that no reflection could ever take away.